I wanted to talk today about an example I came across in some code I was writing where I wanted to start testing some functionality that I have in a view model. So, for a little bit more context, I'm making a Xamarin Forms application, and I have sort of an MVVM paradigm going on. So, I have a view model that gets wired up to a view, and the view itself has bindings back to the view model. So, anyway, the idea was that as I was putting this view together with this view model, I started to realize there's a bit of complex behavior, a little bit more complex than I'm comfortable with, and just assuming it's right. And if I'm going to be iterating on it, it felt like it was in a good spot where I could say, okay, seems to be okay right now. Maybe let's take a snapshot of the functionality by putting some tests in to assert the expected behavior. And then from there, if I need to do any tweaking, I have some sort of test that can kind of be used to regress against. So um, for myself, usually for people that have worked with me or worked on coding projects together, I often talk about I really like focusing on unit tests, and I define a unit test as something that um, is really like a black box test, or sorry, I guess a white box test. Totally opposite. Sorry. So you're essentially with a unit test. I want to be proving that every line is being exercised the way I expect within a method. So they are very brittle. There's a bunch of setup that has to happen. You're really trying to prove that everything that you're calling is exercised and executed as you expect. And then conversely, like a functional test would be that it's less about the details and the exact lines that are being called and everything like that. It's more about does it have the expected outcomes. So again, I kind of said it inverse the first time there, but a functional test being like a black box test and a unit test being like a white box test. So as a programmer and for myself writing a lot of code where I don't have, let's say, like maybe people doing manual testing on the code I'm writing, I really like to be able to have a lot of unit tests so that when something's broken, I can really pinpoint the exact spot in the code. There's obviously trade-offs for doing that. I'm not saying that only writing unit tests is the only way, and this video is going to be, in my opinion, a great example of a situation where I said, you know what, I can't just get away with unit tests. A functional test would be much better for this. So, with that said, I'm going to kind of go through some of the code I got here. I'm going to start with this view model that I have, and I'm going to talk about some patterns in here that I find lend themselves well to unit testing, and some that start to make it a little bit trickier and kind of get me to this point where a functional test made more sense for the thing I wanted to cover. So, personally, I find that if we're passing in dependencies as interfaces in a constructor, depending on the language you're using, so this is C sharp if you're not already familiar with it, there's the concept of like an interface where essentially it's not a concrete implementation of something. It's just the API that we want to be calling. I like using interfaces a lot because when I'm using mocking frameworks to mock out an interface, we're essentially saying by asking for the interface here that this class does not care what the implementation is as long as something can exercise the methods that we're in the properties that we're planning to call. So this for me lends itself really well to unit testing, and the reason why is that I don't have to new things up. And an example of that is right here. So when you new things up, when we talk about doing a white box test, like a unit test, suddenly once something has been newed up inside of here, so we've created an instance in this example of a command. Once we do that in here, our test doesn't have granular control over this. And the reason why is the test wasn't responsible for making this, right? So in a test, I can pass in dummy implementations of this. I can pass in real implementations. I can have some sort of control over seeing what's getting called on these things because the test creates it. In this constructor, though, we're actually making a new command. So when I see the word new, generally, I'm not saying that you can't ever type the word new and you suddenly can't unit test something, but that's an example of something where when I see something like new command written here, it's a good indicator that if I wanted to have, if I wanted to check at some point that this command is doing what I expect, I'll have to think a little bit outside of the box compared to my normal unit testing behavior. Another thing that's interesting on this one is that in the constructor, I generally try not to do this, but we're calling some methods in here. So in the constructor, we have these two dependencies that are passed in. They are view model validators. There we go. I don't know why that was hard to say, but we call validate property on them, and they are going to, the reason why I have it in the constructor is that they're going to sort of set some default state for us. Generally, I don't like to call extra methods inside of a constructor because it's not like, again, it's not something like it's a hard and fast rule and like it suddenly makes it wrong. It's just that especially when we're going to unit test things and check behavior, essentially just by creating, like if we had to go make the system under test, which would be this join group view model, just by doing that, we're already exercising some code, some logic on our dependencies, pardon me. So it's not that it's wrong. It's just that like usually it's a bit of a sign for me where I'm like, it's going to make unit testing a little less pretty. Another reason why I generally don't like to do this is that I know personally that these methods are very lightweight. However, if you get in the habit of, in your constructors calling methods, you might run into, and I have examples in this code actually somewhere else where the logic that's behind this method might actually be something that doesn't execute in like fractions of a millisecond or something, and suddenly it becomes expensive to make new instances of things. That's generally something you want to try and avoid. In my opinion, constructors for objects should feel like instantaneous. So anyway, this something I try to shy away from, but in this particular case, not the end of the world, not a big deal. So this is going to bring us to two properties in particular that were interesting for me, and they're linked to another property. And I'm going to try to explain how all this works, and hopefully this will illustrate why I wanted to test this. So on this view model, essentially the view we have has two text inputs, and they're bound to this group code and to this username property, respectively. So two entries that for text, and they're both bound to these two properties. What I have on here is that we have some attributes and this validation code, and essentially that coupled with this code I was talking about up here is this really cool thing that as a user's typing or entering text, I can essentially put on a couple of annotations here to do checks to see if the user input is valid. I thought this is a pretty cool way to do things. It works out pretty nice in the UI. It makes some bindings pretty easy. That's all cool. But a couple of things that make this not ideal are, for unit testing at least, are that we have these attributes on here. What's tricky about that is that kind of like when I was talking about newing things up, technically putting an attribute on here is like newing up a new attribute. We don't get control over it, right? So when this, if I want to try something out with these regular expressions and these attributes and stuff, it's going to use the real regular expression. So if I want to, like, I have to suddenly have more insight about what I want to be testing, not the end of the world. It just can make things a little bit more complicated. The other thing is that if I'm writing unit tests and I'm putting in mocked validators here, they don't have any intelligence if they're mocked to go pull information from these attributes, right? So suddenly by trying to mock some things out, because maybe the setup to make this validation stuff actually work in a unit test is really intense. And if I'm like, you know what, I just want to make sure that this method's being called, it's being called with this parameter and this parameter, and I'm happy. there might be particular cases where suddenly the setup for this becomes really complicated in my unit test, so I want to avoid it. But the result of that is essentially that if I mock out this validator, suddenly it's completely detached from these attributes. So, I might write some unit tests and someone someday comes along and they delete those attributes. My unit test was never doing anything with those anyway. So the test would still kind of do the right thing, right? It's not actually covering as much as I might want it to. I could write some unit tests that do reflection to check for these attributes. Again, so there's ways around it, but it starts to make things a little bit more complicated by putting these attributes in place. So this other property down here for username it's almost identical to this, so I'm not going to touch on it too much. But the other thing that these properties do is that when we have a resulting change for the property being set, we have some other properties that can essentially potentially change state. So I'll give you an example. There's this can join group property, and we are saying that if someone sets the group code and it happens to be different, which is the only way we can get into this if statement, we want to go make sure that a property change notification happens for can join group. And the reason why, I'm going to jump to can join group. It depends on whether or not the group code and the username are valid. Okay, and those will depend on the state of these validators. So essentially, if someone set a new username, it might change the state of the validator, in which case the condition about whether we can join a group or not would be different. And the same exact thing happens for these, right? So if the username has an error, or this username validation error is the actual text that's associated with the error. So one's a Boolean flag and the other one's the actual textual error. So anyway, these properties basically depend on some state from this validator. So it gets a little bit complicated in that when someone sets a username, a whole bunch of different stuff can happen, right? And it's the same thing with this. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong properties. So the group code, this one here, and the username. Okay, so very similar. They have the same complexities associated with them. But one thing that I was kind of set on was like, in our application, users can navigate to this page, and I want to make sure that the default state of this view model is that users cannot press the button to join a group, which is determined by this property. So it always must be false by default. Okay, so that's something I wanted to have a test for. It sounds really trivial, but it's really important to me, because if the state, because these are complicated, like these, the validation state, the actual text that's in these two fields, I want to make sure that I never have to worry about it, and I have a test that will prove that it's always in the right state. So I thought that would be a great thing to tackle. So I said, okay, cool, let's start writing some unit tests. So I'm going to jump to the unit tests right now, and show you how I started doing them, and then why I actually had some trouble with unit testing this property. Okay, so I've gone through, in my professional career, I've gone through a few different iterations of how I like to set up. I use mock, so MOQ, and XUnit for my tests. Huge fan of both of these libraries and these frameworks. So how I like to set these up, for the most part, there's always exceptions to rules, but I like having an instance for a mock repository and an instance for my system under test. And then for the most part, any dependencies that are passed in as mocks, I like to also have instance variables for them. The reason why is that in XUnit, per test, your constructor is called again. So if I had, you can see I have one test here, and a theory, which is made of a third, fourth, fifth, and sixth test. So there's 6 tests in this file. to go run all the tests, this constructor will get called 6 times, one for each of those tests. So I like making sure that I have essentially one spot that can make a system under test for me. So in this case, a join group view model in the same way. And that way I don't have this code copied and pasted, 6 times for all my tests. It's a lot. And if I'm refactoring things, so say one day I decide I want to add one more parameter to this, or I want to change the order, maybe this one comes out. If I had that in 6 spots, I'd have to go update 6 spots to go do that. So in this setup, there's only one. Another, So if you remember that I was talking earlier, I'm going to jump back to this join group view model. I was talking about some of the stuff in this constructor, not a huge fan of, in particular these 2 validate property calls. Essentially, just by making this system under test, I have to set up these 2 mocks with a call to validate property. I have to do it, or else if I don't, because they're strict mocks, it will explode. So I won't even be able, if I took this out, I can't even run any tests. They'll all fail. So I have to do that ahead of time. Feels a little silly, but because they're strict mocks, that's how I have to do it. And for the record, I will almost always suggest that if you're doing or trying to do a true unit test, that you do use a strict mock instead of loose. A loose mock, essentially, when you call something with a loose mock, you're essentially saying, like, I don't care what this method does or returns. I don't care what it does. I don't care what it returns. I don't care if it was called. And in my opinion, if you're doing that, like, you might be better suited for writing a true functional test. Because when you have a loose mock, you're not only saying, like, that you don't care about a method being called or the return value of it, you're also, it's like a totally imaginary type, right? Like, these are mocked iView model validators. They're not even a real type like that would be in my application. So a loose mock to me feels like, I don't have a lot of good examples of where I'd want to use it. If you find yourself wanting to, I would say maybe you just want a functional test instead. So title's kind of the same thing as these guys. I had to set it up because it's accessed in the constructor. So these feel kind of gross to me to have in my constructor for my test, but not the end of the world. Okay, so to get started with some really simple tests, I said, cool, like, why don't I check by the couple things I was interested in? We're talking about the username property, the group code property, right? Because on here, again, I'm just scrolling through, these are the 2 properties we were talking about a lot, right? Because they have these attributes and stuff. And then this other property, can join group, right? So I said, well, let me write 2 really, really simple tests that I can check the default username, and by default it should be null, right? It seems like maybe like in your opinion, it seems like a really stupid test to have, but it's super lightweight, right? I'm just checking that I made a new group view model, right? Because it gets created in the constructor. I check this username, it's null, and that everything I've set up with my repository, my mock repository, if it's been set up, it's been called. So it's 2 lines of code, and this just proves to me that a default state is that I don't have a username set. Exact same thing for the group code. And then what I went to do was I said, okay, those ones are easy. I want to make sure that the default can join group. So I literally wrote this test. The default can join group state should be false. Okay. And I was all excited because I'm like, great, it's 2 lines of code. That's going to be exactly what I want. And I'm going to go run this. And we're going to see that it's not happy. And it made me not happy. I'm just going to pull out this this window over here. Still waiting on that, but should finish in a sec. It's just Visual Studio being slow because obviously it wants to be slow when I'm recording and streaming. So okay, do something. something's changing. There we go. Okay, so it failed. And then I was like, okay, well, that sucks. Why? And it goes, well, you didn't set up these mocks. I was like, oh, okay, well, yeah, that makes sense actually, because can join group, right? That's the property we're checking. It checks these two other things, which essentially ask the validators if they have errors or not. But here's where the problem is. And it's that if I go to do that, I have to actually tell the validators, because they're mocked, I have to tell them what their state is, because I have to have full control. And suddenly I was like, oh crap, I can't actually test the true default state. I have to make assumptions, right? I have to tell it, oh, your username validator and your group code validator don't have errors to start with, or they do have errors to start with, whatever it happens to be, right? I have to make an assumption about it, and then that will determine the state. So I went, crap, like, a unit test in this example is not going to do what I want. And it's because I want to know what the true, whatever is set up in the actual application, I want to know that actually works without me kind of having full control over it in my test. So that meant it wasn't a good candidate for a unit test. However, I decided, like, why not try and do it anyway with a unit test? I kind of did this after the fact, so I came back and did this. But here's an example, kind of like I just said. I have full control. So if you're not familiar with theories, a theory is like a fact in XUnit. A fact is just a single test. A theory is just multiple tests. And these parameters here, so false, false, true, correspond to this, this, and this, right? So there's 4 different inputs here, and I'm using them for whether or not there is an error on the username and group code, and what we expect can join group to return to us. So I have all the permutations, false, false, true, false, false, true, and true, true, and then whether or not can join group should be the right thing. So you can see that if I went to go do that other unit test I was talking about, I would have to make an assumption about what the actual default state is for these, and that just didn't feel right. So I said, okay, if I can't assume the default state, why don't I do all the permutations? And this kind of tells me that, based on, if I ever want to check can join group, it's really only checking the username and the group code validators. If anyone has a keen eye, you'll notice this is kind of funny, but I don't have a verify all call on here, right? It's just completely omitted from the test. Bit of a tangent, but the reason why I don't have that in here is literally just because of Boolean short-circuiting logic, which sounds super fancy, but it's not at all. Essentially, just because I'm lazy, on these test scenarios, I always set up these 2 validators, right? I always do it. However, I'm just going to jump in here. If is group code valid returns false, because this was false, right? So one of my mocks was false. It will never even try to check this one, because it's called, I'm assuming this is like a standard thing. Maybe I just made it up by accident, but like it's short-circuiting the rest of the check because of Boolean logic. If this is false, it doesn't matter if this is true or false because of this and here. So it never even exercises the rest of this if is group code valid is false. And if that's the case, what would happen is that if I tried to verify all when this was false, is that it would say, hey, look, you set up your username validator and no one ever checked it. And it's not wrong. Like, no one ever checked it because of that short circuit logic. So this is just an example of like where I remove a verify all call, but I will almost always try to put one in. Okay, so that was a unit testy way to kind of approach checking can join group and what it does. But again, I was really set out to find a way to test the default state of it. And the default state means that I don't want to make assumptions about um, how to set these things up. Then I'm kind of cheating because I want to prove the default state. So I said, okay, I'm going to make a functional test for this. So I've jumped to the functional test now. Similar kind of thing here. I'm not going to dive too much into why it's exactly set up like this, but one really cool thing I like to do now in my functional tests is I use autofac an awful lot for like almost anything I make. I start with putting autofac in right from the beginning. I love it. Um, and what it allows me to do is, you can remember, I'm going to jump back to the unit test here, scroll to the top. To make my join group view model, I had to pass in 3 dependencies, right? 1, 2, and 3. If I go back to the functional test, I'm basically, this is a little shorthand. I have a class over here for helping with autofac, but with these 2 lines, I can basically set myself up to then go resolve an iJoin group view model. And this is giving me back an instance of iJoin group view model that's set up exactly how the real application would do it. And the really nice thing about that is that, so if I were to copy, I'm just going to try and do it super quick. Oh, sorry, wrong file. So what happens when I try to do it live? If I wanted to make a new one of these, right? So the alternative would be that I need to make a new join group string provider. I need to make a new view model validator, right? So this, right, that line there and this line should in theory be the same thing. Should. But the one really big difference here is I have typed out 3 specific implementations to pass into this join group view model. This might actually mirror what the application is currently today at this very moment. However, someone in the future might say, you know what? I'm going to go register this other. We're not using the view model validators anymore. We're using fancy view model validators now. So they can go change that in the core application. And so that would be somewhere in autofac for us. And if I didn't change the test, I would still be using these old view model validators, right? And then the risk there is like suddenly I'm out of sync with what the real application is setting up. So anyway, I really like using this approach because I can say, give me whatever is the real thing the application has. And then you can see that my actual test to go check can join group is back to being like a 1-line assert. So I just checked the property and it's false. And to me, that's like exactly what I wanted to achieve in the unit test, but I couldn't because the dependencies I passed in, I would have to go set up, and I would have to make assumptions about how those things should be in their default state. So yeah, that was sort of most of what I just wanted to get across in this example of like, I think that you can absolutely have scenarios where, if I could have unit tested this and it would have made sense, great. But instead of trying to fight with it and be like, maybe I'm putting comments in about here's the default state and like, here's what I'm assuming. Like instead of doing that, and it feels kind of gross, and it's potentially just going to be out of sync with the application at some point. I said, well, I can go write unit tests still for some things, and they might make a lot of sense. And I can have really granular control over what I'm setting up, how I'm executing things. That's great. But the one thing in this example I was really after was like, just tell me that the application will, by default, see can join group on this view model as false by default. That's all I wanted to prove. So really, Like that much code is what got us that answer. So a functional test over a unit test to check this for us. And yeah, that's mostly it. I think that's all I wanted to get across. So yeah, you can use unit tests and functional tests. Another little side note is like, technically I'm testing stuff in the UI. A lot of people might, as soon as there's something in the UI of an application, they're already thinking about, okay, well, what kind of clicking test do we need? Maybe we need screenshotting tests to check the state of the screen. Like, in my opinion, avoid that as long as you can, because if you can check it in code without doing anything fancy with actually exercising the real view, the real application, the better. So I could check that those all work as I expect. Okay, thank you.